We're going live. Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump Recruitment discussion. This week we've got a big question on building high performance teams. Is your team structure a catalyst to performance? Before we sort of start off into that, I'm going to sort of roll out some facts, but I've looked at sort of facts in a very different way than high performance team. I'm looking at why we should perform in a high performance way and what that looks like. These stats have come out of Salesforce and a couple of other places. And what I'll do is I'll drop into the chat box the links from there. But here are the stats. 18.8 of business buyers are more likely to buy if companies understand their goals. 59% of most salespeople do not understand what their buyers' goals are. 84% of business buyers expects the salespeople to act as a trusted advisor, but only 73% say most sales interactions are transactional. There is no trust. Salespeople spend 70% of their time on non-selling tasks, and that hasn't reduced for an awful long time, according to the Salesforce people. And the number one growth, 70%, yes. The number one growth tactics for sales leaders and managers is to improve their sales enablement and training. And the top enablement activity is sales strategy review, which 53% of sales teams use. The least popular activity is one-on-one meetings with managers, which only 32% have regularly. High-performing teams are 2.3 times more likely to perform or underperform as a team unless they're using guided selling. And over the next 3 years, sales teams, around about 98% of them, are going to be using guiding selling as coaching and capabilities grow. And what guiding selling is analyzing current trends, historic sales, customer data, etc., etc., etc. So we're doing an awful lot of that, but it's about then increasing their capability to sell a unique product to a client. So have we got our EVP right? According to another study, okay, engaged employees outperform low-performing teams by more than 200%. A recent study said high-performing employees are 87% less likely to leave an organization. A recent Gallup study, businesses with a higher level of employee engagement had a 21% higher level of profitability. And according to that study in the Harvard Business Review, a high-performing sales team receive praise from colleagues, 72%, and from managers, 79%, which is why they are high-performing indeed. So this week I'm joined by Dave and Heather. Paul is on client site, so we're going to kick straight into some questions. So they're quite interesting questions this week. So the first question is, what specific strategies do you use to assess whether your current team's structure is truly driving high performance rather than just maintaining stability?
One of the ways I've seen, Howard, which you've got to be a fairly sizable organisation for it to work, is actually to measure high performance by team and by manager. So most of our managers in recruitment businesses are billing managers, and so obviously we're measuring their own productivity, but actually comparing team by team things like the success of hiring, like retention, like speed to competency, like performance measures, metrics between managers, and comparing and understanding why there are differences can be, you get what you measure, right? So are we finding metrics to measure the difference between different teams and the structures that we've got? But you've got to be fairly big to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's important that for each individual agency or each individual leader, you define what high performance is. Yes, so many agencies I see, they will say, well, actually, say take the tech world, first year we expect 120k billings. Do you? Is that appropriate? Is that what's going on in your market? So you spoke about data early on, Howard. I think leaders should use as much data as they can to define what performance they expect. Now, if they expect 100k billings, then high performance is 120, or is it? What does high performance look like in your organization, and what are the steps to get there? So I think almost before you answer the question, as a leader, you need to put that definition in there. And what is stability? What does stability do? Does stability mean if you did 100K last year, you're going to do 100K this year? Because if the market's gone down by 20%, yeah, that could be high performance. So you've got to have all of that data as a leader, whether you're a desk leader, a sales director, or an MD. You've got to have that data to define that first before you start measuring it.
So they're two really interesting answers, and interesting in different ways. I think what you're talking about there, Dave, is you've got your normal measures of, what high performance looks like, but then you've also got the measures of what stability looks like. But are they all about performance? Because I also think, Heather sort of touched on a little bit there about the people and things like that. And I think there's a bit there that, some time ago, I read a book and saw a guy called Sean Acor who wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage, and how happy people are more productive. And certainly looking at the stats, that sort of links to that. So I think I'd look at the happiness of the individuals and the harmony in the team and what that looks like. And that doesn't mean pandering to them, but it means running regular surveys, running teams, and having that strategy review with the team rather than just a strategy review with a few individuals. And I think that would then help to reduce the strategy to execution gap if people know and they've got that more opportunity to add into that strategy. And so I think if everyone is achieving their personal and professional goals, then the business will be. But to do that, I think you've got to look at how happy people are within the business and what that looks like. And I think, we measure everything, but we don't tend to measure people's, enjoyment. And I think once they enjoy what they're doing, they perform better at it and perform more of it. And I think that's a really interesting sort of view that you both sort of touched on it, but didn't actually come out with that comment.
Can I ask you a side question, Howard, that comes up from what you just talked about to do with, one of the measures you mentioned there was surveys. I'm genuinely interested in what you two think about the value of surveys. I've worked for people in the past who are like, don't ever survey, my staff hate surveys, don't like them, and others who really see value in the business. So I know this is an aside to our normal questions, but I'm genuinely curious as to whether you think surveys are a good or a bad idea in organizations if we're talking about data.
Dave?
I think they're a good idea because to me it goes to culture, Heather. For me, it's not just a survey; it's what you do with it. So for example, I've been on sales tours where they have ideas boxes. For example, if you've got an idea, but they don't do anything with it. So it just sits there as some dormant kind of vehicle. But a survey which is asking, what do you think? What do you think? How can we do things? How are you in your business? That could be a way of measuring happiness. Because that's quite a difficult thing to measure, isn't it? But I think surveys, if done well and done in an open, non-judgmental way, and then feedback is given, and people who work for the company can see that having contributed in that way, things have got better, or things that were not good have stopped. I think there's a really good place for surveys if they're done well.
I think understanding is important. I'll go back to the book, The Happiness Advantage. Okay, so Sean Acor is a very clever man, went to Harvard, became a Harvard grad, did his PhD at Harvard, now a Harvard lecturer, never left Harvard. And I actually asked a question in his presentation about, well, what do you know about the real world and how the real world works, etc., as you've never left education. Okay, I thought, let's see what he has to say. And his answer was this. He said, we had to do an awful lot of research on people coming to Harvard to understand why we had such a problem at Harvard. And I said, what problem have you got at Harvard? You've got the most intelligent people and probably the most richest people. And he said, yes, we've also got the highest suicide rate in the world of education. And I said, okay, and how does that work then? He said, think. When you leave your school and go to Harvard, you're probably in the top 1% from an educational and intelligence point of view, and you're probably in the top 1% for finance and capability point of view. When you get to Harvard, 50% of you are already below average. There's only 1% in the same marketplace that they were when they left school. And therefore, we have a lot of people who struggle massively. And he did a massive view on optimistic and pessimistic people and how they worked, and it was all about surveying the are optimistic people or pessimistic people better at performing tasks. And he did a study of 200 people where he graded them through a review on who was optimistic, who was pessimistic, and then said, right, okay, go out and do this. Gave them all $10 and said, you've got to go to a store, buy something for $10, come back with the receipt, the item, and $10 without committing a crime. 90% of the pessimistic people failed, 90% of the optimistic people achieved. And it was all about their aspect of looking out. And he suddenly realized if you can change people from optimistic to pessimistic to optimistic, you'll get a better result. That all came from reviewing people committing suicide and why they did that and what happened and how people went from pessimistic to optimistic. And you can change that by the environment that you're in. And so pushing that into a sales process says you can actually do certain things in the sales process that creates the happiness advantage in your sales team, that creates a more cohesive sales team and therefore a more productive sales team. But unless you know that, you can't do that. Surveys will give you that advantage and that information that will help you get there.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Genuinely interested. I think the key for me in both of those things is quality, like good surveys, good questions, good follow-up. I think too many organizations just use them in a really bland way and off the cuff and then do nothing with the data.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people don't like them.
Yeah, and that's the bit.
It becomes a complainer's charter.
Yes. And that's the bit, and you give, it's the questions that you ask. If you put poor questions in, you get poor data back. It's the questions that people are: are you happy with your salary? Are you happy with your commission? Everyone's going to put no on that. Everyone's going to put no. It's just, so why even ask the question? It's all about the other things that make those things that they should be asking the questions on. Okay, so let's move forward anyway. So how do you measure whether your team is maximizing financial performance and contributing direct to the business recovery in this post-downturn period?
I think it's interesting on financial performance, because I think if we're talking about sales consultants at the desk, and this is a bit of a generalization, forgive me for this, but most of them don't have any idea about the financial performance of the business. They may know in reviews how the business is doing, but I doubt whether they would know exactly what their desk cost is, or how much it costs to make calls, or if they sign a new contract or if they win a new business, do they look at things like, well, what's the debtor days? You know, do I get paid 30 days on invoice, or do I get paid 30 days a month after the first invoice? Because most salespeople aren't aligned or aren't told all of that sort of stuff for whatever reason. So I don't think they always know what the financial performance is. I think they know if I do 3 contract deals at this margin, this is what I get. But I'm amazed at how many salespeople, when they're doing a deal, don't know what that means to them in commission while they're on the phone to their clients trying to close the deal. So if I can get an 18% margin, I'm going to earn £132 more. Yeah, the clever agencies have commission calculators. Yeah, and you can see. So if you're trying to drive, go back to your first question, if you're trying to drive higher performance, you could do that with data. Actually, if you can squeeze an extra, percentage out of your client, or don't do it at 18%, do it at 18.1, because 18.1 makes the business £632 and you get £52. I don't think most companies have those sort of discussions. So I think if you can, the more that you can share with your staff, the better. I'm not talking about the stuff that you don't want them to know in terms of how much the owners take and all of that sort of stuff, but I'm talking about what it costs to run a business and how you can make that better. I think a more open sharing culture would help with that.
Well, I'm just in communication with Heather because I think her Zoom has just locked up, so I'll jump in whilst Heather sort of sorts herself out and works from there. So
I thought she was so transfixed by my answer, Howard. She's just stunned.
I think the answer is no to that, Dave. So I think you touched on the right things there, Dave. What gets measured gets improved, and we've often talked about that and how that works. And we tend to measure and reward on financial performance. But if I go back to that question we just talked about, and we talk about, do we measure the culture? Is it an enabler or a detractor from our financial goals? So things like your turnover rate and things like that would be really interesting to sort of look at. And I often talk about 4 things. I talk about strategy, execution of that strategy. Do people like the strategy, i.e., your sales staff, your clients, your candidates, and suppliers? And then does that drive cash into the business? And I think the critical thing to hit financial success is more about the team engagement. Are they happy? Okay. And if that stat is right, that high performing teams are 200% outperform normal performing teams, then it's got to be about the happiness of that team and what's going on. And if you think that total engagement leads to 21% more profitability, it says, we're measuring all the physical stats that make a deal, etc. And therefore, should we be measuring the temperature of the culture as well, and whether that could dial that number up or dial that number down? And we've all worked in cultures where we feel less appreciated, and you do less. And we've all worked in cultures with managers that we feel are brilliant, and you'll go that extra mile for. And I think that's the bit that we've probably become so fixated on data that we can look at, manipulate, and work out, as in your financial data and performance data. We've stopped thinking about the people. And I think that's the bit that we've got to start to think about the culture and what that temperature is like. Is it one that warms people up, or is it one that cools people down when it comes to performance? And therefore, whatever you're measuring from a financial point of view will make no difference, because that culture will always cool or warm that. And I think it's a really interesting sort of point that we tend to have forgotten about. And I don't know why we've forgotten about it, but we tend to have. But that's as it is. So I think Heather she's obviously got your mouse, Dave, and has not been paying it to renew the internet for her from there. So let's move on to the next question, okay? And I think this was what we were talking about. I'm going to push on a question a comment that you said earlier on about the average billings per month for a consultant. So I'm going to pull that in a couple of questions time. So what indicators or benchmarks do you evaluate if your team is delivering above average profit per head, and how do you leverage this data for continuous improvement?
As owners of businesses, this data is available to us because if you get Recruiter magazine, every year they do the Fast 50 and the top 100. And in there, they have profit per head. So you can go down there and you can look and say, right, what sector am I in? Which other companies in my sector, and how are they doing? Now, it's Companies House data, so it could be 12 to 18 months, even maybe 2 years out of date, because obviously it's not some empirical data from last week's management accounts, but it still gives you a benchmark. So, for example, there's a company called Shilton Sharp Quarry who are in the legal space. We don't work with them, they're not a jump client, but they have an enormous, a really, really high profit per head because they have big fees, it's all perm, and they do really well. And I look at that and think, wow, that's amazing. But I then look at where my clients are in each sector and pick out the ones that are doing really well. And Jump has had some clients in that top 50. And I think that data gives you an idea of where you are. But it's up to the leaders and the owners of businesses to say, well, let's take that data and let's look at it for ourselves. We've got a large back office team who do a fantastic job. They cost us this much per consultant. But how many do we need? Do we need more? Do we need less? Can we outsource it? It involves all those type of questions, Howard, in terms of what benchmarking and what's good. I know at least 2 companies I can tell you about that when the number of people on the sales floor dropped by about 20%, the number of people supporting the business stayed the same. So that would affect profit per head. And if you're trying to benchmark it, you've got to look at all the different dynamics that make up the cost of running a business, including the things like I said earlier about debtor days, about how use of tech and all of this sort of stuff. So it's not an easy answer, but I think it's having the data at your fingertips, desiring the data. I think if you're a big enough company, having a really good operational FD is really helpful. Someone who takes and looks at the data, that looks at how long it takes, it looks at how long, you said it earlier on, cash is king in our businesses. So how long does it take from getting that requirement to getting the cash? And you can do that by desk, you can do that by sector, you can do that by office. I think if you've got it, then you should use that to make informed decisions about when you hire, about do you stay working with that client? Because although they're giving us requirements, it's taken a long time to fill any of them and they're difficult. So it's all of that. It's there to provoke a conversation that I think as leaders we should be having with our people.
So I think just for Heather's come back on the middle of that. So the question was, what indicators or benchmarks do you use to evaluate if your team is delivering above average performance per head or profit per head? And how do you leverage this data for continuous improvement?
Howard, move on because I don't know what Dave's already said. So
okay, I'll move on. I'll answer.
I don't
I'll
want to repeat.
It was brilliant.
I don't want to repeat it, make people listen to if I say the same thing.
If you repeated that, it'd be amazing. No. So I think what Dave's saying is right, is that, what is the average profit per head can be measured in so many ways, and each agency is different. And I think it's more important to measure for a business to see if the collective, the business is performing. So I think it's important to measure it. So whether the UK average you said was about 10k a head per month. However, is that 2, 3, 4 placements, or is that one placement? It might be depending on your average placement fee of 20k, whatever, etc. So I think, once you have that average, I think what we tend to do is we don't track the trends, Dave, and I think that's what we should be doing, is tracking the trend over a longer period of time. So is it 10 grand? Is it 10.5 grand? Is it 9.5 grand? What's happening? And we can then start to see whether it's increasing or dipping a little bit earlier. Because I think we tend to wait till we get the financial data in, because we're not tracking that data on a regular basis and looking at it. And therefore we can start to see we're averaging 10k. Well, actually, if it's the last 2 months, we've averaged 9.8. All right, but it's only 200 quid. But hang on, if that 200 quid hangs on for another year, that's a lot of money that we're losing. So we can start to identify it earlier. We can start to address it earlier. And that's the same when we start to see continuous improvement. We can start to say, well, what are we doing differently than we did 6 months ago that's making that continuous improvement? Is it our process? Is it our strategy? Or is it the market? What's actually changing? And therefore, we can start to evaluate things quicker, easier. And therefore, we can start to push things into our business. As you said there, if our sales floor has reduced by 20%, but we haven't reduced back office by 20%, then, profit per head is going to drop. But should we be looking at why is our headcount dropping in the first place? And could we identify that earlier by identify the trends? And I think that's the bit that we seem to think we take the profit per head figure, but we never actually think about developing it as a trend and looking at it over a longer period of time to see why. And so if it slightly dips, we should be addressing it. So you think, is it flatlining? Is it dropping? Is it increasing? But we can see that over a longer period of time. So I know if for 6 months it's been at 10k every single month for 6 months, but in September all of a sudden it's dropped to 9.8, I should be addressing that straight away and not going, it's only dropped by 200 quid. That's not a problem, because it drops again next month and the next month, then that is a problem. But I address it early, and sometimes because of our sales process, I always think whatever we do today will put itself on the P&L in 3 months' time. That's a long period of time. So we should be able to address that by the data that's coming through and what creates that profit per head, and use that all the time. Here's a better question then for you then, Heather, as you come back in. Okay. In what ways can mid-performers negatively impact the overall performance of recruitment teams? And how do we address this without creating internal friction?
This is a really interesting question, Howard. You're right. It's a great one. It's a great one for us fluffy HRers. You don't do data and numbers and financial performance. I think it depends on what you mean by a mid-performer. So it depends on your definition of mid-performer. So if it's a mid-performer in terms of they are only achieving 50-60% of the potential that they have, that's going to negatively affect your business, because you are being seen as an organization to tolerate effectively average, right? So you've got a real negative impact on people in the organization, because people are kind of getting away with doing a half-assed job. If, however, they're a mid-performer, but they're working to their capacity, but there are other reasons, they're on a particularly challenging desk, they're in a particularly challenging market, that's not the same kind of mid-performance. And it's about how you define a high-performing team, right? We need in our organizations, we can't all be superstars, right? We can't all be those absolute stars. We need a backbone of solid recruiters in our business, and that, I don't mean that in any way derogatorily. Solid performers that will do a lot of our business, as long as they are working to their best capacity, then we won't get a negative impact from it. The negative impact comes from where average is just tolerated, that we're not driving for people to be the best that they can be.
Yeah, but Ellie, you're absolutely spot on. I think it's potential. I've often said, thank God for the mid performers. If most of our companies had 60% of the people performing on average, just about hitting their target, they'd have 20% superstars, and maybe they've got 20% that are less good, and you've either got to train and develop them, or sadly they have to go. But if you have a chunk of 60%, you know that you will be running a profitable business. And some people, if they are hitting that potential, if their targets are 90k a year and they're moving between 89 and 92, wonderful. Thank God for them, and let's have 100 more of those, because in scale, if you know the data from the previous questions that we've looked at, and 90k makes us as a business 20k, well, let's load up the 90k people. Whatever that works for in whatever sector you're in.
Unless we know that their desk and that person is capable of working at 140k, in which case 90, 89 to 90 is not good enough. No. Right, but you've got to understand the detail, and you've got to understand the individual, and you've got to understand the desk. And the issue for me that causes negativity, Howard, is that tolerating meh.
Yeah, right. And then what happens is that the top people, if the medium people are tolerated, the top people leave. Yeah, because they want to be surrounded by other the top performers want to be surrounded by people who are reaching their potential.
Yeah,
and if their potential is mid-performance, well, that's okay. But if their potential is at 200k and they're doing 50, then
nobody says anything. Yeah.
So I think, as you said, to me, that's the biggest balancing act that we have.
Yeah.
And so either you're just hitting target or just missing target. And I think we're all read the steady heads in the business. I think the high performers think they're slowing them down, which is what Dave is saying there. And the poor performers use them as a benchmark of success. But every team needs those steady heads in the business. So I think some people don't need or want to be pushed. So managers need to know when to push and when not to push sometimes. And I think sometimes those steady people come a little bit stale because no one pays attention to them. And when I suppose they become a great barometer of your success of your business. Are your steady people steadily growing, or are they declining, or are they just flatlining? And I think these people need training, they need motivating, but most of all, they need looking after, because they're just a steady person. We look after the poor performers because we need to manage them out of the business or turn them around. We look after the great performers because they're great, they're making all the money. And then these people get very little sort of praise to a certain degree. So if they appear to be negatively impacting the business, maybe it's us, maybe it's the managers of the business, and maybe the management needs to change to ensure the culture can, I suppose, motivate those mid-performers to step up by 5%, 10%, 1% every single time, because every company is made up. Dave, you said you'd love 60%. I think most companies are made up about 80% of steady performers, 10% flying, 10% not flying from that point of view. So if they're not performing, I think we should stop blaming the people and look at the strategy.
Mm.
Because I think
Completely
it's
agree.
how we're managing them is probably the poorest thing, and probably because we manage the poor and manage the great, we never manage the average.
Well, we just leave them to get on with it, right? We just
Yeah,
leave them to get on with it without
exactly.
understanding the real potential that sits in that group of people.
Yeah. And if you then start to think about your strategy to performance gap, those people in the middle of it, if we can increase their profitability by 5%, 10%, that massively closes that gap, because there's more of them than there are the superstars. Yeah. And that's a real interesting sort of view on it. Okay. So what are the qualities or skills that distinguish high performance in recruitment teams? And how do we identify and nurture these traits during hiring or internal development?
Well, if I think back to the high performers that I have managed, the sort of words that I would use to describe them are: they're tenacious, they're driven, they've got an element of courage. Yeah, they don't take no, and they want to persevere. And actually, when I look back, often they're happy. To your point, Howard, and for the most part, a nightmare to manage. That would be my experience, and I love them. I can't say a bad word about any of the ones, even if they are a bit of a nightmare, because that comes with the territory. Because we're in a salesy organisation. Now that's a bit of a generalisation across everybody, but they're the sort of things that I've seen, and I say all of those in a positive way, not in a negative way. Yeah, and when I look at how they are outside of work, they're exactly the same. Yeah, their character is exactly the same, and sometimes we expect people to be different inside of work and outside of work, but it's their life, and that's the way they run their lives, and they're great. I don't know whether you think that's true, Heather.
Well, to be slightly controversial, I think this question sums up everything that's wrong with how we hire people in recruitment and how we view them. So we don't know is the answer to this. We don't know. We think we know. We don't really think about it. We don't do the research to find out. We hire people because we've experienced qualities in the past that have made people successful. But there's no science behind it. We don't really understand what makes people good, which is why we got such dreadful turnover. I think we talked about this last week, didn't we? We're absolutely hideous turnover in this business because we don't really understand. And also we get high performers who are a nightmare to manage, Dave. And then we tolerate that, right? And we don't look at the damage that does to our culture. So for me, we've got to be much, much better at understanding what success looks like, how we recognize it, how we nurture it, and how we have success in our business and high performance that doesn't actually damage you can nurture a diva in the business and they make you loads of money, but they damage everybody else around them and they damage the culture. And so, I think this is a big red flag danger area that as a recruitment business as an industry, we need to be much more sophisticated about. And we'll save it for another podcast, but there's a really interesting piece of research going on at the moment about exactly this, which we can talk about on another webinar, but it's a fascinating piece of research happening about it. Sorry, Had.
So I think this is the genuine $1 million question, isn't it? Genuinely is. And I've had, numerous £1 million billers. And what I've noticed is that they couldn't be more opposite from each other if they tried. And they had all very different traits. But one thing that was obvious is that their behaviors and their values were very much aligned. And what we found was once we removed the negative ones, as you were saying, Dave, the nightmare ones out of the business, and we just left with the good people that all aligned to the rest of the people, we saw huge growth within those teams. And so to me, it's not the traits of the $1 million bill that counts, it's the traits of the manager and how they're motivated, how they're praised, how they're managed, and then how their people add to that team. And I always think that if you're going to add to a team, you've got to understand the behaviors and the alignment of those behaviors. And that's what make a good team trait. It's not about the individual, it's about the team performance. And, we go back to some of the comments that we've made sort of in earlier webinars. I remember removing a person from one of my offices who was not quite £1 million biller, but approaching that point, but had 120% turnover of staff.
Mm.
Once we moved that person from the office, our turnover dropped to 15% in the next year.
Yeah.
And the
We get
office,
blinded by these high performers. We're absolutely
absolutely.
blinded to the damage they're wrecking.
So how they perform and how their personal traits, they were all very different. I had one person that was absolutely gregarious, one person that was almost introverted, etc. But their values were very much aligned and they performed unbelievably. And you're right, Dave, outside of work, they were exactly the same outside of work. But it was how they were managed and how they performed in that management. And I remember one of those billers said to me, one of the best things that I'll take as my own sort of piece of praise. We said, "You're great at motivating. You motivate me like you wouldn't believe, but you brought me down to earth when I needed bringing down to earth. But you didn't bring me down to earth and destroy me. You brought me down to earth and made me build, made me work, etc. And when I started building teams, I used the same process. And to me, it's about that they don't have to be divas, but it's how you manage them if they are. But it's how they align with the rest of the team. And therefore, it's about the managers, who they recruit, how they motivate, how they praise, and then how they distinguish between the good and the great. And that goes back to that question of the one about, the negatively impacting mid-performers, how the good, because those mid-performers are good, and how you manage the great is really important.
Yeah, well put, Howard.
Yep.
So what are the qualities then or skills that distinguish sorry, I've just gone through that question. Next question, quick blip. Okay, I'll edit that out in the real version. Okay. How do you ensure your team structure then is adaptable and capable of sustaining high performance as the business landscape continues to evolve?
Yeah, this for me is about, you touched on it in your last answer, how this is about your managers. Right, you've got to have really quality managers who are agile enough to be able to adapt to changing markets. We've all been in the recruitment business long enough to know that what goes around comes around, right? We move from market to market to market, but there are so many people in this industry who are less experienced and maybe haven't realized that the requirement to be agile is really, really important in this industry. It's one of the things that makes it so exciting, right? No 2 years are the same. So I think for me, it is that culture of supporting your managers, training your managers, creating an agile culture, staying on top of the data, and staying on top of the performance so that everybody feels confident to adapt to change, to make changes, to make suggestions, to communicate with you when things are changing in their market, whether it's on a client face or a candidate facing. It's culture, it's values. It's all of. Sorry, that's a big mixed answer, but it all really ultimately comes down to the behaviour of your managers and the quality of your managers.
Yeah, and I think a question for me, Helen, on that is, are your managers being measured on their understanding of how the landscape is evolving?
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that should be closest either to the sales staff or the clients. They should be able to look above the parapet and see, actually, this is coming down our way.
Yeah.
I've always said this quote before because it's a David Bowie quote, and I love David Bowie, but the future belongs to those. The future belongs to those that can see it coming. Well, your eyes and ears out there are your managers. Yeah. So are you asking them as leaders? Are you asking them the questions about, well, which way is the market going? How are things coming? What's happening with your clients? Do they know what's happening in your clients' markets so that they can be agile enough to say, actually, they're not going to be doing that anymore. They're going to be doing this. We're not going to go right. We're going to have to go left. And I think as leaders, it's our responsibility to encourage our managers to be doing that and giving the feedback, so that as we go to the budget cycle, as we go to performance reviews or whatever it is, we can see the markets changing and how we can adapt and be as agile as you say, Heather, we need to be.
You know what, I thought about this and I've sort of listened very carefully to both those answers. And I think my people description about 4 months ago was absolutely perfect. recruit for the team, not for the position. So to
Yeah,
sustain high performance, you need to constantly motivate and challenge the team. Input from the team will help the management adjust to the strategy, not just the goals, which will help then the execution and achieve and exceed the goals that you're setting. So we talk about this all the time, get the right people in the right seats. And as a manager, sometimes it's about getting out of their way so they can perform. And the art of sustained growth is the innovation of the procedures internally to benefit the clients externally, which I think then benefits the employees internally. And in the end of that line is the business owner. It will benefit the business owner. So to assure that, I'll go back to what you both said there, is one bad hire can put a massive spanner in the works. So your manager
Really?
becomes really important to recruit for the team, not the position, and then look at how you adjust your strategies, not your goals. Don't adjust your targets or your goals, but you can adjust your strategy and how you execute it so you can get closer to the goals and targets that you're aiming as a business, not about individuals. And I think it's important to push that. So last question then, and Dave will love this one. What tools or systems do you use to regularly evaluate team performance, and how do you ensure your team is always on track to get to the finish line, whatever the finish line looks like for you?
Why will I love this question?
Because you just love tech, Dave. You're just a tech lover.
Well, I tell you what's interesting, because I did a presentation yesterday at Team. So they had their Southern event conference or whatever, and we were talking as a group of recruitment owners about how do we measure our people, and actually what we decided was everybody over measures. They buy the latest piece of tech and put it in, or they do something like that, and it's what they do with the data that matters. So I think as owners, what you need to know is what do you need to know to measure your people to enable them to reach their potential. Go back to Heaven's words from a few questions ago. What is it? Is it a combination of tech and CRM data? And then the question is, if it's CRM data, has anybody ever been able to answer the question, why don't consultants put data on the CRM? Company I was with last week, they just did the whole deal, without ever putting it on the CRM. Yeah. So you've always got that challenge with that combination of tech and non-tech. I think as an owner of a business, you need to know what you're going to use to measure the people as simple as you can, what the potential is and how you're going to measure it. And if it's a combination of tech and KPI type stuff, then that works really well. But don't overcomplicate it and don't over measure. Because the danger of too much data is we spend more of our time trying to get the data and analysing it without ever using it properly.
I think we've got masses of data in our businesses, Dave, that we don't use, but I do think we should be using. I actually think we should be using more of it, right? So, but using the right stuff.
Yes.
So one of the biggest changes I saw in quite a big organisation I worked with was when we created dashboards that every consultant and every manager saw on their desktop every morning when they started work. And we created dashboards of real-time data of the things as an organisation we felt were important. And boy, did it help people decide to put stuff on the CRM, because effectively, if it wasn't on the CRM, it didn't happen. And their stats that were visible to everybody, all kinds of league tables and stuff like that. The visibility of that data made them realise that actually it was important. And then, of course, we got all the additional benefits of being able to use it for good marketing. So I think be careful about what you measure, but use the data that you have got well and carefully. But as you'd expect with somebody from an HR background, it is about the people, not about the technology. So all of the tech is great, it's brilliant. We're not using it enough. There's a real layer of sophistication we can use to the way we analyze the data we've got. But ultimately, it's the value of how good are your one-to-ones? How good are your team meetings? How good are your company-wide meetings? How well do people understand what's important to you as an organization? So I think you need to use tech, and I carefully curated and very visible but I think it's much more important to think about how you're communicating. How well are your managers having one-to-ones? How well are your leaders having team meetings? How well are you having company-wide organisations, and how good is your communication?
So I absolutely agree with everything that both of you said there, but I think we're missing a
I knew there was a but coming.
Here comes the but.
We're missing a slight.
Wrong.
No. You're both right. We're missing a slight point. Okay, we measure performance of individuals, etc. We measure performance of the teams. We measure performance of the business. Okay, what we never do is measure the performance really against the strategy of what we've got. And you start to think that you've got the strategy of the business, which should then melt down to the strategy of the managers, which then melt down to the strategy of the team leaders, which then melt down to the strategy of the individual. And then how we review that individual then should feed back up the chain about how our strategy is working. But as a industry, what we're very good at, and as business owners, what we're very good at is saying, well, my strategy is perfect. They've just got to work harder. Okay. And we never actually listen to what's actually heard or what's going on. So you could have all the tools in the world, but unless the bottom of the line knows exactly what the strategy is at the top of the line to achieve the results and how they get that, and all the links in between that know how they link, then what we measure will never improve unless we link it back into the strategy and make sure the strategy is capable of being executed to hit the performance that we want. So I think we've got to start to think that we've got loads of data, but how does it actually work, and does it link back? And again, I keep saying this. We blame the people too often rather than blaming the strategy. And we should start to think about how we review that strategy. So I think the tools that we should be looking at should all link back into looking at what we're actually trying to achieve and what's the strategic goal that we're trying to achieve. How we're doing that is those things, identifying areas of opportunity or areas of distress in the business that are then preventing our people from performing or allowing our people to perform more. So I think we could talk all day on this topic. I think it's a great little subject and a great topic. So I'm going to lock it up there for today. Next week, we've got a really interesting conversation. We've got a new Jump associate coming on, Kate Parker, Corn Ferry, Odgers employee. So really high-end search and selection. And what she's going to talk about is the difference between what we think is retained business and contingent business to what proper search and selection people do from a retained and search and selection business. And that will help us start to build a better retained model from a perm point of view, but also from a contract point of view, because she's also talking about taking on retained businesses where they're taking 150 type positions on as a retained model. So it'll be a really interesting conversation. So I look forward to that next week. Kate's panicking already and writing lots and lots of notes and details on it from there. So hopefully you'll be very good. But I look forward to seeing you again. She will be. Dave, Heather, thanks very much. Ladies and gents, thanks for appearing this week. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thanks very much.
Take care.
Have a good week, everybody. Thank you.
Take you later.